Egypt is celebrating the loyalty of the Nile. When many contemplate the name Nile, the first thing that comes to their minds naturally is Egypt, which is easy to explain given the great importance of this river to Egypt throughout its history. There are many myths associated with the Nile, including that the Nile is the gift of the gods and that its flood season begins with the appearance of the brightest star. When it overflows, it brings prosperity and fertility, and many, many other things. Of course, Herodotus, that great Greek historian, summarized the importance of the river to Egyptians by saying Egypt is the gift of the Nile. And with us here to talk about this celebration, the celebration of the loyalty of the Nile, is Dr. Atef, travel expert and PhD in heritage and museum studies. A very good afternoon to you, Dr. Atef. Always a pleasure to have you with us. So, Dr. Atef, loyalty of the Nile, what does it mean to you, this celebration?
Well, the celebration of the Nile is very important, and the Nile itself is, of course, very important. You just mentioned that Herodotus, the historian, said that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. And I personally don't know why this saying is so famous if the same guy, Herodotus, said something else that's even more impressive. Well, Herodotus said that Egypt is like a candle that stays at the bottom of the Nile. When the whole area around it is dark, this candle floats on the surface and lights the whole area around it. And is this true? It is true. Look at the world today. I mean, when anything happened any place around Egypt, lots of people come and stay in Egypt. When the troubles happened in Syria, lots of Syrians came here. When the troubles happened in let's say Libya, lots of Libyans came here. There are lots of Sudanese who live here. There are lots of Iraqis live here. There are lots and lots. And the thing is, we do not deal with them as refugees. They melt and blend with the Egyptian society and live as part of Egypt. Egypt is sure the gift of the Nile, and the word Nile came from the word Nilus, and the word Nilus means the victory or the land of victory, and it's a Greek word. And the Greeks had a myth that the Nile comes from the moon, floats from the moon. The Greeks didn't know Lake Victoria, Lake Albert, where the Nile, comes from today, and they believe that the Nile comes from the moon. That's a Greek-Roman myth. The Nile is the vein of life for Egypt, is the vein of water for Egypt, and if you take out the Nile from Egypt, Egypt will be just desert, because it seldom rains in Egypt. It's like 7 centimeters in Cairo a year of rain, and 17 centimeters in Alexandria a year, and that's about it. So the Nile is the cause of life, and Egypt for sure is the gift of the Nile.
Indeed, Dr. Atef, and if not for the Nile, there wouldn't have been this great Egyptian civilization. I mean, the oldest civilization in the world. You talked to us about some of the myths associated to the Nile. One of them, gods Osiris and Isis played a role in one of the famous legends. Would you tell us more about that legend?
I will, and I'm happy that you said Isis and Osiris, and you didn't say Isis, because they used to say Isis. They call Isis as Isis, and no, it's Isis, the goddess of love and magic for the ancient Egyptians. And the story says that Isis and Osiris, they were married, and Seth, the brother of Osiris, was jealous from Osiris, because Osiris was beloved by the Egyptians. Well, Osiris was sure the one who taught the Egyptians how to cultivate the lands, how to harvest their crops, and how to make their clothes, and how to make their furniture. And that's why they worshipped Osiris and they loved him. And I'm talking about the ancient Egyptians. Seth, his brother, was jealous, and he decided to get rid of his brother, and he cut him to pieces. So he invited all the ancient gods to a famous party, and he made a coffin, a sarcophagus, that was very fancy. And he asked all the gods to try the coffin, and when the turn came to Osiris, and he slept down in the coffin, he closed it and sealed it and threw it in the delta. Well, years later, when he was hunting in the delta, I'm talking about Seth, he found his brother, So he was afraid that he would come back, so he decided to cut him to pieces. He cut him to 40 pieces. Well, actually, some scholars believe 42 pieces, and scattered it all over the country. And that's how the 42 states of ancient Egypt were formed.
What an amazing story indeed.
And then Isis, the wife of Osiris, with the aid of goddess Hathor, the goddess of love, joy, maternity, and magic, was able to bring back the pieces of her husband, of her hubby, Osiris, and they got married, and they gave birth to Horus, the falcon, the god of Luxor. So that's mainly shows how, how evil was there, and then the good was able to overcome the bad. And Horus was able to overcome his uncle Seth in a place today known as Edfu, where the temple, the famous temple of Edfu is, by the banks of the Nile. And actually the temple, the Greco-Roman temple, was built to commemorate the victory of Horus over his uncle Seth.
Wonderful. Dr. Atef, how did the ancient Egyptians celebrate the occasion of the loyalty of the Nile?
Well, the ancient Egyptians for sure appreciated the Nile, and they knew that if the Nile was not there, there would be no civilization. They were living by the banks of the Nile, and it was flat, and when the Nile floods, they flood their fields, and they plant their crops, and they wait until they harvest the crops. And they had those seasons, the flood season, the dry season, and the harvest season in the past. The loyalty of the Nile for the ancient Egyptians was a ceremony that was celebrated by slaughtering, giving offerings and donations, rams and cattle, and feeding the people, and giving charity, and dancing, and having music, and fun, and this and that. Now, this big ceremony in the ancient Egyptian time, they thought by giving all those donations, the Nile would flood again by giving those offerings. But it was mainly animal donations or animal sacrifice that was given to the Nile. And they believed by this way the Nile would be loyal and it would flood. And they resembled the Nile by God Happy, H-A-P-I, and God Happy was kind of hermaphrodite. He kind of had both sexes in his body, because they believed that the Nile created himself by himself. And that's why Happy, the god of the Nile, was the cause of the flood. They thought that if Happy is happy, then the Nile would flood, calmly and peacefully.
I like it, Happy is happy.
Happy is happy, yeah. And, but if Happy is angry, or not very happy, not content, then maybe the Nile would be aggressive, and maybe it would flood the villages, or maybe it would not flood at all.
Amazing. Polluting the river Nile in ancient Egyptian civilization was considered a crime. It still is considered a crime today. Could you talk to us about that, especially in ancient Egypt?
Yes, the ancient Egyptian religion, or the ancient Egyptian cult, cared a lot about keeping the Nile clean. It was a sin to pollute the Nile. And they believed that the deceased in the ancient Egyptian time would be asked questions. Did you kill? Did you lie? Were you good to your family? Were you good to your country? Did you pollute the river? And he shouldn't pollute the river. And the deceased, or the ancient Egyptian, when he dies and he's resurrected and he's asked the question, he would deny the sins. So he would go and say, I did not kill, I did not lie, I did not pollute the river, I did not. He would deny the sins. Not only this, he was not supposed to charge the woman and her kids, her girls, her daughters, to cross the Nile. It seems in the past that there was no bridges, and the people were using those boats like kayak boats, crossing back and forth. And they were not supposed to, according to the ancient Egyptian cult, to charge a woman if she's crossing the Nile with her two girls. So those were one of the teachers of might and the teachers of ancient Egypt. I did not do the sins. That's why we like to call the ancient Egyptians the kings of denial, because they deny all the sins, in the past.
Wow. Very interesting. Dr. Atef, some claim that ancient Egyptians used to throw the most beautiful girl in the Nile until it calmed down if it was, if the water was angry. How do you view this accusation? Is this true? Is this a myth, as far as you know?
there has nothing been proven that the ancient Egyptians really threw a girl or a bride or in the Nile, and that's a myth. That's a myth, and this myth actually were known not from the ancient Egyptian times, but from the medieval times, when the myths became very active, and they said that. But it has not been proven that they would throw a girl or a beautiful girl or whatever. It's just symbolic, and people like to make a story out of it. It's a good story and a good advertisement, I would say, for the ceremony. It's like salt and pepper, like exactly what happens in Hollywood today, for instance.
Yeah. So, we all know, of course, that without the Nile, there wouldn't have been this great civilization.
Yep.
Could you tell us about some major points that demonstrate that? I mean, the role of the Nile in the development of the greatest civilization in the history of mankind?
Well, the Nile is the cause of life in Egypt. And I was just saying to you, sir, that if you take the Nile of Egypt out of Egypt, it will be just plain desert. So the Nile would flood, and people would wait for the flood to come, and then they would irrigate the lands, and they wait for the crops to come, and they would harvest their crops, and they would have the food. Different crops, and the lush vegetation by the banks of the Nile was huge. By the way, in the past, it seems that it was more green and lush and vegetated more than today. I mean, there was no buildings like that. People were living all by the banks of the Nile, and it was all green. And this gave them time to think and to meditate and to contemplate. So they would wait and think. I mean, see, when the Nile floods, when the sun rises, when the sun sets. So they started to think about life and death. And actually they used the Nile for transportation as well. It was more active with transportation in the past. I mean, moving all the stones and the obelisks and everything, they used the Nile, big barges. And also they found out, I mean, they used the east side of the Nile as the side of living, and the west side as the side of death, because of the sun rises on the east and sets on the west. So they build their temples and their homes on the east bank of the Nile, and they build their tombs and pyramids on the west bank of the Nile. So the Nile gave them a chance, and the country was rich, by the way.
Of course.
I mean, the country was rich.
Of course.
And that's why, by the way, other nations started to look and want to get benefits out of Egypt. And that's when the ancient Egyptians, I mean, the ancient Egyptian pharaoh decided to create this army to protect his territories. You know, people ask me about this ancient Egyptian civilization. It is, I mean, accommodated with the Nile. I mean, it came parallel with the Nile. And actually, when you look at the temples today, it's all built by the banks of the Nile. When you look at the pyramids, it's not far from the Nile. They were very much attached to the source of water and the source of living. The Nile, by the way, is considered to be the longest river in the world.
Right.
If you counted the switching canals of the Mississippi, and then we stretch the Mississippi, well, the Mississippi will be longer, but we're not going to stretch it. So as it is, the Nile is longer. 4,400 miles, like 6,400 kilometers, brings the water from Lake Victoria and Lake Albert all the way in Africa, goes through 9 African countries until it goes into the Mediterranean. The depth of the Nile is like 8 meters at the deepest, by the way, which is like a 3-story building. And the bottom of the Nile from Aswan all the way to Esna, which is the south of Luxor, is granite.
Wow.
The bottom. And from Esna all the way to Alexandria, to the Mediterranean, is limestone.
Beautiful, beautiful.
And that's why we happen to find lots of things, I mean, in the Nile. I mean, statues. And if you do excavations in the Nile, and I'm sure you're going to find obelisks, you find statues, you find this and that. The Nile actually is, Egypt is blessed with the Nile, and up till today. I'm originally from the countryside, from a village. And I remember when we used to go to the village in the past, they used to say, the river is here. I mean, they use this term. The river is here means the canals are filled with water, and they can irrigate the lands. So whenever, I mean, they use this expression, the river is here, means that we're ready to irrigate our land.
Well, I mean, we never got enough talking about the Nile.
Sure.
I mean, we are here called Nile TV International. So, I mean, the Nile is Egypt, and Egypt is the Nile, really.
You can say that again. Yep.
Yeah. Dear viewers, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this segment. On behalf of you, we thank very much travel expert and PhD in Heritage and Museum Studies, Professor Dr. Amr Atef.
Thank you, sir.
Great pleasure having you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hope to see you again.
Hope to see you again.
Dear viewers, please stay with us here on Nile Cruise. We'll be back on Nile TV after this.